Right, welcome. House Environment Committee. This afternoon, we have our legislative council here with us to, I guess, is it considered a walkthrough, Michael? We're gonna walk through Act 121.
Sure, a review of
Yeah.
prior action.
And just so members are immediately oriented, this is what Lauren Oates was talking about. She was sort of setting the stage, reminding us of the why. And then this will be the nuts and bolts of the how of the Flood Safety Act.
What year was it? This last session?
Well, it should just come up under Michael's name today.
Okay.
Act 121 of
When
2020.
we take new testimony on stuff, we'll repost it, or at least the link.
Well, my iPad is not loading the committee pages, so
Yeah, I love when that.
I'm gonna assume you have Act 121 from
Okay, well,
2024.
it is
on the committee.
It is on the committee page.
Okay. All right, so I'm gonna work off of a hard copy then, because I can't get the committee page to load. So in 2024, there was an effort by advocates and the agency to propose language to regulate multiple aspects of what I would call water law. So there was regulation of development in river corridors. There was an effort to address how municipalities in the state implements requirements for national flood insurance under FEMA's requirements. There were amendments to the wetlands law to change the policy and how wetlands is permitted. There were provisions related to dams. There were provisions related to, let me think of some more. Styrofoam in waters. And that was about it. It was a fairly comprehensive act. It was 65 pages long. And it did a lot, and it required A&R to do a lot. And you will see from the first page of the bill that it has a short title. It's called the Flood Safety Act. That's why everyone is calling it the Flood Safety Act. In addition, it had a pretty significant findings section, several pages long, where it referenced why you were doing this, and specifically the first 11 sections of the act related to flood provisions. And so it said the Northeast has experienced 60% more rain, particularly in inland areas. The climate assessment highlights that Vermont has a 21% increase in average annual precipitation and 2.4 additional days of heavy rain since the 1960s. According to NOAA, there's been annual damages from flooding and flood-related disasters between 1980 and 2023 of over $30 million. There has been, according to DEC, 70 to 80% of all flood-related damage occurs in Vermont's river corridors. That according to DEC, only 10% of Vermont municipalities have flood river corridor protection programs or bylaws, and that promoting existing compact settlements will require improved flood resilience efforts as described in the Climate Action Plan, such as fluvial erosion hazard planning and looking at climate adaptation response. And the state, as recommended in the initial Vermont Climate Action Plan, should adopt legislation that would authorize the Agency of Natural Resources to revise the Vermont Flood Hazard Area and River Corridor Rule to provide the agency with delegable statewide jurisdiction and permitting authority for new development. So it then goes right into river corridors. And what are river corridors? Well, there is a definition of river corridor in statute in 10 VSA 752. It's the land area adjacent to a river that is required to accommodate the dimension, slope, landform, and buffer of the naturally stable channel, and that is necessary to natural maintenance or restoration of equilibrium conditions.
It's not here. You're reading that from a different area.
I'm reading that from 10 VSA 752. It's not in the bill itself.
Sorry, can you read it again?
Sure. A river corridor is the land area adjacent to a river that is required to accommodate the dimensions, slope, landform, and buffer of the naturally stable channel, and that is necessary for natural maintenance or restoration of equilibrium conditions.
Yeah. Representative Pritchard.
How is that determined?
Oh, I
They,
used to do that work.
yeah,
You go out in the field and you measure it. I mean, first there's a phase one geomorphic assessments that rely on a model. And they sort of give you that, and then you field verify it. And you go out and you walk each segment of river and you measure a cross section and you measure the buffer and where the banks are. And it's very detailed work that a number of folks did over 15 years. Representative Tagliavia.
Thank you. How to that, your explanation and Representative Pritchard's question, we heard testimony just this morning talking about how rivers move.
That's
How do we take into account river over, I don't know, 10,000 years moving?
Yeah, so a couple things. One is we're having the river section in and they can answer our questions on this. And that's what the model does. And so there's different stream types, just like maple syrup, water quality standards, A, B, and C types of streams. And they have to do with the type of river they are in their reference or natural condition. And then we model them when they have impacts to them from human developments. And then there's a way of like estimating what the river corridor is. And we look at soils, we look at slope, we look at historic alterations to the watershed. It's quite a long list. There's great data. We can show you the link to the webpage where all the data is stored, and you can look at the river right behind your house and see how wide the corridor is there.
and I would say generally a river corridor is not affected that much by slight changes in a river or even like changes over 5 to 10 years, because the river corridor the map is usually much larger area than you would expect. Now, the area of special flood hazard under FEMA's NFIP program, that might change, but they have a directive to update their maps on a regular basis. So as that river moves, that their FEMA map will move as well. And plus, banks don't really rely on the FEMA maps anymore. There are services,
That doesn't really rely on
banks,
banks. Oh, okay.
because the banks, when you buy a house, they will check to see if it's in an area of special flood hazard. And there are services that now use all the different technology that's available to locate the potential purchase and to identify whether or not it's within that area of special flood hazard or not, because it affects their mortgage. It affects what happens if there is a flood and damage to a property that's under a mortgage at a bank. And so the banks have a very real interest in ensuring that those maps are accurate and that then they have services that double check them.
But to answer your question, the river corridor accommodates a certain amount of meander belt migration, but probably not to the, like what you're speaking to, like the ancient glacial movement of that river. But it's an area that is defined by science and a little bit by sociology, admitting that at some point we need to like we give the river enough room to accommodate the water, sediment, and energy that it has today in a reasonable river corridor area, but not necessarily its entire historic range.
You call that the meander belt?
Meander belt width is
Okay.
that curve, that sine curve that a C-type channel will make out in the valley.
So let's talk about what we're talking about. Why are we talking about river corridors and how are they different from flood hazard areas or areas of special flood hazard? So FEMA, if you want flood insurance in the United States, you basically have to get it through FEMA, or else you're paying rates that I don't even want to characterize. In order to get FEMA flood insurance, your municipality has had to adopt a bylaw or ordinance that meets FEMA's requirements for the regulation of development within that flood hazard area. Well, the FEMA flood hazard area is not based on the type of flooding that is more common in Vermont. The FEMA flood hazard area map is based on inundation flooding. It's like it rains in Minnesota, so we know in Arkansas in 3 days, the Mississippi River is going to be at over the tops of the levees, or that they have to trigger the levee controls in order to prevent flooding of. That's inundation flooding. Vermont does have inundation flooding. A few years ago, Lake Champlain, we knew that it was rising and rising and rising and rising. That was inundation flooding. But most of the time, the state has what's called fluvial erosion flooding. It's when there's discrete high volume rainstorms that don't do inundation damage, they do scouring damage. And that scouring damage can hop the bank and move further than the inundation flooding does, because of the nature and the volume and the rate of the flooding. So that's what the river corridor maps. It's not that inundation, it's the where that scouring can go. Most of the time it's especially in lowland flat areas, it's a pretty significant distance from the actual channel of the river. Now, it also depends on geomorphology. If you've got high banked, rock banks, the river corridor is not going to be that much further from the flood hazard area, because there's nowhere for that high volume flooding to go on that side. But it will probably wind up going across the riverbank into whatever area is available. So that's the difference right now. Now, development in the flood hazard area is regulated because that's FEMA. If you want to build in that flood hazard area, you have to have compliance with FEMA's bylaws. Right now, there really isn't requirement for development, or prior to Act 121. There wasn't a requirement for permitting in the river corridor. That's what these first sections of Act 121 does. You will see on page 2 going on to page 3 that the first thing that's required is DEC, in consultation with the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, amends the river corridor map to identify areas suitable for development that are located within existing settlements in the river corridor. So where can we develop in the river corridor? And let's map that. And then beginning on January 1, 2025, DEC was going to do this education and outreach program. I am going to note those dates that are changed, or any proposed amendment that's in the DEC miscellaneous bill. On page 3 of Act 121, first line of subsection B, that the agency is proposed to move that January 1, 2027 date to January 1, 2028 for that education and outreach. Similarly, the report back to you about what they collected in that education and outreach, that's going to be pushed back a year too. And that's at the bottom of page 3, where it says on or before January 15, 2027, they shall submit to you a report. And that report's supposed to include public input, It's supposed to include recommendations for changes to the requirements for permitting of development and map corridors, an analysis of state permitting of development, and a summary of the department's progress in adopting rules for development and map corridors. Now, where is the requirement for permitting development and map corridors? Well, that's in section 4. And that's where you see what is required and what will be permitted. And what is going to be permitted is development according to FEMA. And that's pretty much everything. That's you stacking your firewood. That's you farmer stacking hay bale. That's disturbance of the soil in a way that could create an additional 6 inches to a foot of rise, which will affect flooding. Like pretty much anything that you do in that special flood hazard area is development to FEMA.
Representative Pritchard.
Is it, I'm looking at the text in here, and it says the department shall submit to the Senate Committee on Natural Resources and Energy and the House Committee on Environment and Energy. Is that both?
No, that's just because we used to be that when we passed the bill, we
Okay.
had energy.
Okay.
And that's been reconciled in the statute because we go in and whenever the committee names change, our office changes those in the statute.
That is an interesting question because some of the bills would go to both of us.
Yeah.
Presumably you're using your smarts on that one first.
We have to make decisions sometime.
Representative Talia Villa.
Development, that definition, you said something about stacking firewood. So just so I know, I understand correctly. Somebody's doing some logging on their land and the best spot for them to have the log landing or whatever, have their truck pick up this timber or firewood is stacked in one of these areas. That is considered development, even though it's only going to be there for anywhere from 1 day to 1 or 2 months. That's development. In the same respect, the wrapped bales of hay, if they're stored for a season. Do I understand it? That's what you described as development?
Development means any man-made change to improved or unimproved real estate, including but not limited to buildings or other structures, mining, dredging, filling, grading, paving, excavation, or drilling operations, or storage of equipment or materials.
That's in current FEMA,
That's
federal regulations.
current FEMA regulation.
Currently supposedly being managed, although people don't get a permit for that in a federal permit for that.
No, it's you get your municipal permit for that because remember, in order to have NFIP, the municipality has had to adopt ordinance or bylaws that regulate that development in a way consistent with FEMA. So that's how FEMA does it. They don't permit themselves. They basically
Delegate.
incent you to do it, municipality to do it. Now, the state ran into a problem with FEMA a few years ago because municipalities are not under state law allowed to regulate certain things. They're not allowed to regulate forestry operations. They're not allowed to regulate the siting of a state building. Until the Supreme Court decision last year, they weren't allowed to regulate farming. And FEMA said those activities involve development. And there were letters back and forth. What do you want us to do? You need to regulate those activities that are exempt from municipal authority. And the state General Assembly chose to do that in a different way. They said the state is going to adopt rules to regulate that development that's exempt from municipal authority. And there is currently a river corridor rule that regulates those activities that are exempt from municipal regulation. And FEMA said, that's fine. You now have regulations and standards that regulate all development in the special flood hazard area. So that's why at the bottom of page 4, you will see a definition of development exempt from municipal regulation. Well, it said, well, I'll just move on. So that's how you dealt with development exempt from municipal regulation. And then moving on to section 5 in Act 121, you were on page 5, going on to page 6. It directed the Agency of Natural Resources on or before July 1, 2027, which the agency is asking to be 2028 in your current bill, to adopt rules that establish requirements for issuing and enforcing permits for all development within a map river corridor in the state, and for development exempt from municipal regulation and flood hazard areas. Well, how are you going to do that? Like, think about that. If the definition of development is like so broad that it includes grading and excavating and filling and storage, they're going to adopt general permits. They're going to adopt general permits for those types of activities like storing your firewood or storage of hay bales, etc. But for development of structures, etc., they'll probably have both a general permit and an individual permit for certain scale or scope of development of buildings or structures. So it might sound onerous because of the scope of development, but it's probably going to be a general permit. And why do I think it's going to be a general permit? Because that's how the state regulated that development that was exempt from municipal regulation over the past 10 years. And it hasn't been, you don't hear about it because it just works.
Right. Representative Chapin.
Can you just articulate for us again exactly how a general permit works and how people should engage the permit?
So most people, when they think of a permit, they think of the individual that goes to the regulating agency, makes one application, and the regulating agency reviews all of the things for that individual and issues the permit. And the next person could come up and have the same exact facts and apply, and they'd have to do an individual permit again. Where it became clear that there were certain types of activities where there were so many people with so many similar circumstances or conditions that you didn't have to issue an individual permit each time. You issued one permit that was an umbrella, and it said, if you're doing this and you qualify for this, and this is the type of activity, then you have to do this. And all you need to do is notify us that you are going to operate underneath that general permit. And that's how general permits work. It's not you apply individually according to your specific facts and the agency reviews your specific facts. They said, these are the general facts, the general conditions. If you fit under it, you're fine. You just let us know that you're operating. You can still be enforced against if you violate the terms of that general permit. Still be enforced against. But that's how a general permit works. And you will hear some people refer to a non-reporting general permit. And that's usually a federal thing, but you don't even have to have you don't even need to have a report in some general permits. So moving on from there, when they adopt the rules for permitting of development in a river corridor, they have to address certain things, like what are the requirements for permitting? The regulatory exemptions for minor development activities in a map river corridor. The way to delegate this authority to municipalities. Some municipalities already have river corridor bylaws, are already regulating development in the river corridor. If they want to continue to do that, delegate it to them. Let them be the ones to do it, but you have to have some standards for that delegation. And then set a process for amending the river corridor map so that if the river moves, or if there are certain changes, that you have a map that's amended to reflect that. Now, the requirements for the rule are specifically supposed to be more, they're supposed to exceed the requirements of the NFIP program. And by the whole nature of having it in the river corridor versus in the special flood hazard area, it will exceed the NFIP program. But there were concerns that just regulating to the minimum would not be enough to address the flood threats that the state is facing. So just as I referenced earlier on page 7 in subsection C, this will be a general permit, or the agency is authorized to issue a general permit for this development. It doesn't need to go through rulemaking, which will be easier for the agency. And then on page 8, this is where you get the actual requirement for a permit for development in a river corridor. Act 121 said, beginning January 1, 2028, a person shall not commence or conduct development exempt from municipal regulation or commence or conduct any development in a mapped river corridor without a permit issued by the secretary. So they are proposing to move that by a year from January 1, 2028 to January 1, 2029. Then I think the next major change for Act 121 is on page 10, section 6. This is about, we're moving out of permitting development in the river corridor. And we're now going to focus on NFIP. When the floods occurred 2-3 years ago, Irene, there was obvious need for response underneath the FEMA bylaws that each municipality had adopted. But many towns didn't have the resources to respond. Many towns lacked expertise. They had done what was required to get flood insurance for their communities, which was smart, but they didn't have the resources or the staff, the expertise to respond when there was that flooding damage, when to assess, how to implement the FEMA response, how to get those homeowners, those property owners into the FEMA system for relief. They didn't have those resources. And some of those towns came to the General Assembly and said, you either need to give us money for those resources, you need to figure out a way to coordinate this at a state level. And so what this does is it requires that on or before January 1, 2026, A&R shall adopt rules that establish a set of flood hazard area standards for enrollment in NFIP. And so, wait a minute, I already said in order to have flood insurance, you need to comply with FEMA's bylaws, right? You need to do that. But you probably have all served on municipal boards, you don't always do what you're supposed to do. And you always have somebody that's fly specking the language and says, like, I don't like that language, or I want that to be different. And so what happens is that the municipal bylaws that are for NFIP aren't always what they're supposed to be. Now, towns are supposed to give their proposed bylaws to A&R for review so that A&R can say, hey, yes, you do meet the standards, and this is consistent with what we, as the program administrator for NFIP in the state, want you to do. But not all towns do that. So you have some, and you should talk to A&R about like what the variation is in NFIP bylaws for each municipality across the state. And so what this does is requires a uniform NFIP standard that all municipalities will implement. And so those rules shall contain the flood hazard area standards that meet or exceed the minimum standards for NFIP by reducing flood risk to new development, ensuring new development does not create adverse impacts. Any municipality with a municipal flood hazard area bylaw shall update their bylaw or ordinance to incorporate these state flood hazard area standards. Now, everybody has to be the same. Everybody has to be the same. Nothing shall prohibit a municipality from adopting a more protective flood hazard area standard with language and standards approved by agency. All right, if you want to be different, you still got to get approved by AM. And on or after January 1, 2028, which has not changed. So they are still looking for 2028 for this. The state flood hazard area standards will be adopted and shall be the state minimum flood hazard area standards. But what does that mean? In order to get FEMA compensation, you need to be complying with the state minimum flood hazard area standards. So if a municipality doesn't adopt them, they are putting at risk their property owners, their residents, of whether or not they're going to continue to be in the FEMA program. Now, FEMA isn't like black or white, you're in, you're out, you're gone. FEMA gives you a probationary period to comply. But during that probationary period, your insurance rates go up for the property owners. So municipalities are very aware of that. Municipalities will need to meet these standards so that their residents' flood insurance rates are not affected. So I think you can move on page 11. So to ensure that it's easy for municipalities to incorporate these flood hazard area standards into their municipal bylaws. Sub C on page 11, A&R has to come up with the model bylaw, or really they already have a requirement to issue a model bylaw. They need to revise their model bylaw to include these new state flood hazard area standards. Municipalities should be able to just plug in their information from their municipality to make that bylaw work. Now you get a lot of technical changes because right now municipalities have discretionary authority to regulate in a river corridor. Remember, I told you some municipalities already have river corridor bylaws that regulate development within their river corridor. What you've proposed already is if once the state adopts those rules for regulation of development of river corridor, that those municipalities can seek delegation of the permitting authority. Well, you got to take away their discretionary authority then. It's no longer a discretion for them to regulate the development in the river corridor. And so that's what these technical changes do. Section 6A, you're amending 24 VSA 2291, municipalities discretionary ordinance authority, to say that they no longer have the ability to regulate development in a river corridor protection area. Section 724 VSA 4302, you're now in zoning bylaws. This is one of the principles of the zoning chapter about regulating new development and flood hazard areas and river corridor protection. You're now taking that out. That they have to meet or exceed the statewide minimum flood hazard areas standards established by A&R. Section 8, again, you're in a municipal zoning authority. Municipal zoning authorities have flood resilience plan requirements. Those strategies need to adopt and implement the state flood hazard area standards.
All right, Michael, is there a date associated with these changes or where?
These are in the effective date section. Oh, no, they're in a transition section. I'm sorry. They are in section 11. It's basically 2027. It's the Act 121 requirement that the permitting begin in 2027 and 2028.
Yes, I'm just wondering if these changes were requested also.
In the transition section,
They need to be.
they have not requested changes to those dates in the transition section. So there's conflict.
Yeah.
And so they will need to request a revision to that.
Change the dates, yeah.
Right. And I have to talk to you about something called vested rights, which is, I'll get to in a minute. So section 8A is about River Corridor Development Authority, and now it's just going to be about regulating buffers. Section 9, again, is about regulating River Corridor, and it's now just not going to be about regulating development in flood hazard areas or other areas. I think you can skip to section 10, which is on page 18. So NFIP flood insurance is currently implemented by municipalities. The state's going to have a state flood hazard area standard that all municipalities need to conform with. But that doesn't address the technical staffing response issue that occurred with flooding 2 to 3 years ago. And what is being looked at is in section 10 is whether or not the state should take over administration of NFIP for all towns. And there's a study committee to review and recommend how to reduce vulnerability to inundation flooding, including and to what scale to shift responsibility for administration and enforcement of NFIP from individual municipalities to the State Department of Environmental Conservation. So this is just a study right now, but they are going to come back to you with a recommendation on how to do this or whether to do this, how much it's going to cost, what staffing needs it would need if they were to do it. Remember, the towns say they don't have the resources. I remember someone from Wyndham saying, and he was the local planner, and he's like, I was the only one that knew anything. And he's like, I didn't know that much, and I didn't have the resources to do what I needed to do. And so that's why this is in here, to look at how and whether the state can coordinate NFIP from the state level instead of from the municipal level. And some states do this. Some states have hybrids. So it's not, you wouldn't be unique or first in time.
I hope they consider the benefit, I mean, the cost to municipalities of not, savings to municipalities of not. Seems kind of not, to have every single town do this seems very inefficient.
How do the RPCs?
And expensive.
Well, that's a good question. Maybe the RPCs become something of a contracted entity for the state in implementing NFIP, right? It's like, because some of the RPCs are really pretty good, like your RPC is really pretty good, but some of the RPCs are, and so maybe that's part of the recommendation of the study committee.
Well, I was wondering if you knew of states with county level government, like, does this really happen town by town all across the country, or is it because we don't have county level government?
It doesn't happen town by town all across the country. It's often done through counties. Like I have always said that if you had Maine's county government, my job would be so easy. I would just tell the county to adopt everything that you wanted them to adopt. Right? And then I'd be like, it's not my issue, and what the county's got to do. And that is how a lot of places work. And they then have those governments, in some places, some states, it's not just the county, it's entities within the county that are not just municipalities. There are groups of municipalities, like townships, like in Pennsylvania, or regional districts in Minnesota. It's like you coordinate your staffing and your technical expertise around more than one municipality.
But not the whole state.
But not necessarily the whole state. because of the size of states and the geographic differences, et cetera.
Representative Austin. Typical.
Raise my hand.
Well, you did raise your hand. You want
Did
like,
I?
You stuck
I
your
was,
hand
I
out.
probably was like, just reading
I think
something.
you were distracted.
Can you, and maybe it's very obvious, but what is the difference between the NFIP and the hazard standards?
So the flood hazard area standards are what the state is directed to adopt so that all municipalities will have the same bylaw in order to qualify for NFIP. So it's what the state will set as the standard for municipal participation in NFIP. Remember, I told you how some municipalities do it different, some ignore certain things, some write it differently. This is to ensure that they all have the same thing. So when there's a response needed, you go out to one municipality and they lack the authority in their bylaw because they never submitted it to A&R for approval. You will have consistency, you will have uniformity. And then the question is, should the municipality administer it or should the state administer it? You haven't made that decision yet. It's just whether what this study committee is supposed to recommend. Now, this committee is looking for a date change in the miscellaneous bill. It was supposed to provide its report on August 15, 2025. That didn't happen. I think they're looking for a 2-year extension.
ooh,
But it might be 1 year. So there's that. And then on page 21, there's a transition section. A&R is supposed to initiate the rulemaking, pre-rulemaking for development in river corridors by July 1 of 2027. And prior to the effective date, they shall continue to implement the flood hazard area and river corridor rule for development that's exempt from municipal regulation. And then we got to talk about vested rights. So in most jurisdictions in the country, when you are applying for a permit and the law changes between when you apply and when the agency issues your permit, you have to comply with the changed law. So even though you didn't even know what the change law was at the time of application, most jurisdictions, most states require you to comply with that change before they issue the permit. In Vermont, we don't do that. In Vermont, when you apply for the law, you get the benefit, apply for a permit, you get the benefit of the law at the time you applied for the permit. And you are not subject to those changes. Now, people will tell you that that minority interpretation only applies to land use, municipal land use, and water resources. Well, this is kind of both. And so the General Assembly said in 2024 that the vested rights where you get the benefit of the law when you applied for it is going to apply to these permits. So if the mapped river corridor development rules change and you've already had your permit application in before those rules become effective, they don't apply to you. You get the benefit of what the law was before, provided that you don't do anything that would trigger a new permit underneath the new rules. So you go forward with what you proposed. You get the benefit of the old law. If you start deviating from that and building new things, putting in new excavation, etc., you don't get the benefit of that anymore, and you may be required to get a permit under the new rules. That's what page 22 subsection C says in a lot of legalese.
I mean, you call it a benefit, putting yourself in harm's way may not be a benefit. That's what this is intended to keep people out of harm's way.
Right, and you know, I'm gonna go off the chain a little bit and like, why are you doing this, right? And bad water finds you, right? Bad water is gonna find you sometime in your life. You're gonna get flooded, your septic system's gonna fail, your connections are gonna fail, bad water's gonna find you.
No idea you're such a pessimist, Michael.
It's just reality. But bad water often finds the poor more than it finds others. And so part of what this does is that it will help standardize development in areas where bad water may be more frequent or common. Remember, at the beginning of this bill, you direct ANR and ACCD to find the places in the river corridor that are suitable for development. Where should you go? Where should it be? Not just where you can do it and get away with it. It's like, where is it more suitable to be so the bad water doesn't?
Just one more question about vested interest. If a builder, let's say, comes upon something that they didn't anticipate and they need to do something different than their land use or and their unvested rights,
So
do they then have to do everything?
now remember, they get the benefit of the law from before.
Right.
And part of the benefit of the law before is when you apply, there are provisions in that law that allow for conditions or you will still get that. It's when you start going too far outside of the scope of that law that existed before that you will need to get that permit. And that's what you did for lake shoreland protection. That's what you've done for some stormwater. That's what you've done for some wetlands. You've given the benefit of vested rights to the permit applicant. And now you move into wetlands, which is, I'm sure, what everybody wants to talk about. And I think it's very interesting to look at what you did in 2024 because the General Assembly made specific policy statements that don't seem to be aligned with the executive order and the draft rules that are going to be coming from that executive order. And you'll see that first on page 23 in section 12. It's declared to be the policy of the state that the wetlands of the state shall be protected, regulated, and restored so that Vermont achieves a net gain of wetland acreage. And that regulation and management of the water resources of the state, including wetlands, should be guided by science, and authorized activity in water resources and wetlands should have a net environmental benefit to the state. But that is existing state policy for the management of wetlands.
Existing before this act passed or now it is because this passed?
This has passed.
Yeah, I know, but anyway, Representative Tagliavia.
Net gain. How we determine net gain at the end of the year, whether we got a doubling based on the development or each individual site?
Well, can I defer that answer? Because we're gonna get there and walk through how you do net gain. Section 14 requires the update of the Vermont significant wetlands map in order to include what I don't know enough about. The georeference shape files or similar files for all verified delineations performed within the state The experts will tell you that that is a much more detailed mapping and accurate system. I don't know. I just wrote what they told me to write in 2024. But that's the intent. What I will say is that the date by that which that is supposed to happen, January 1, 2026, was not changed by the miscellaneous DEC bill. And obviously that date has passed. And so there's a question about whether and how those maps are being updated right now and when they will be updated. And then on or before page 21, sub B, on or before January 1, 2030, A&R shall complete a higher quality wetlands inventory plus level mapping for all of the tactical basins in the state. This will include ground truthing. Again, that date is not changed. So you have these new maps that are coming, supposed to be higher quality, more accurate. But they're not requesting changes to those dates. And then at the bottom of page 24, section 15, the net gain of wetlands. On or before July 1, 2025. This is not changed by A&R in the DEC miscellaneous bill, but this section is in your bill. On or before July 1, 2025, A&R shall amend the wetlands rules to clarify that the goal of wetlands regulation and management in the state is net gain of wetlands to be achieved through protection of existing wetlands and restoration of wetlands that were previously adversely affected. Now, how do you do that? On page 25, the rules shall prioritize protection of existing intact wetlands from adverse effects. Where permanent activity in a wetland will cause more than 5,000 square feet of adverse effects that cannot be avoided, the Secretary shall mandate that the permit applicant restore, enhance, or create wetlands or buffers to compensate for the adverse effects on the wetland. The amount of wetlands to be restored, and this is where you get the net gain, shall be calculated at a minimum by determining the acreage or square footage of wetlands permanently drained or filled as a result of the permitted activity and multiplying the acreage or square footage by 2 to result in a 2-to-1 restoration to wetland loss. And there is your net gain. And it's for each permitted activity over 5,000 square feet of adverse effect. Couple of key aspects of that calculation: establishment of a buffer zone contiguous to the wetland shall not substitute for restoration, enhancement, or creation, and adverse impacts to wetland buffers shall be compensated for based on the effects of the impact on wetland function. That is something that I am not sure the EO does. So if you're going to have an adverse impact on a wetland, which remember the PowerPoint showed on A&R's own website that
Cattails in the living room.
the cattails, that would be an adverse impact on a class 2 wetland. What's the compensation? Is it over 5,000 square feet? Does it need net gain? I don't think the draft rules address that. And maybe the draft rules are saying, we won't need to do this because we're an allowed use. And allowed uses are not a permitted adverse effect. And therefore, don't need to do net gain, don't need to do compensation because it's allowed. And I think that's probably what they're going to say, but I can't speak for them.
Can you repeat that just to make sure I understand that?
So you need, if you're gonna conduct an activity in a wetland that has an adverse effect on that wetland, you need a,
Mapped or unmapped either?
well, right now, it's class 2. And class 2 means a mapped or one that the secretary determines based on the functions and values of the wetland is significant enough to require regulation. All right, so that's a class 2. Right now, if you're gonna do any adverse effect in that class 2, you need a permit unless you are in allowed use. And you don't need a permit, you just need to notify the secretary of your activity so that they can determine you're not trying to game the system.
Allowed uses housing.
And the allowed use in the draft the draft rule by A&R, which I put up on the PowerPoint, is housing in those designated areas, not requiring a permit in class 2 in those designated areas, not requiring a permit in the class 2 in those designated areas on a map, not requiring a permit for any unmapped, and reducing the buffer from 50 to 25, 50 statutory foot requirement to the 25-foot requirement for a class 2. And that's in the draft rule. But how does that, I mean, how does it conform with the policy? Because you amended the policy for wetlands to say that the policy for regulation of wetlands is now net gain. And you amended that policy to say that decisions need to be science-based, but you're taking away that science-based determination that a wetland meets the function and values that require regulation as significant. Referencing this because if they come forward with a rule that does just an allowed use, I'm going to be the one that's going to be required to review it for LCAR. And one of the things that I have to do is I say, is it consistent with statutory authority? Is it consistent with legislative intent? I don't opine on legislative intent because I'm not a legislator and you all have different intents about what you do each day. But I will say that there's potentially an issue with conflict with statutory authority. So that is, I have to put this on the table now. I want to put it on the table now so that whenever they bring forward that rule, you don't get mad at me if I say it doesn't, if there's an issue with it.
Yeah, I'm still a little, and I apologize, it's kind of confusing for me, at least still. A little confused about when the class is coming to play. Does the EO specify? It sounds like it reduces for class 2 wetlands, it reduces the buffer from 50 to 25. But in the section where you're just allowed to build in a wetland, is that class 2 wetlands or is that something other than class 2 wetlands?
Well, all right, right now you don't need a permit to develop in a class 3. A class 3 it has some wetlands properties, but it's not significant enough to regulate. Class 1, they say in the draft rule, we're not dealing with class 1. And those are the ones that are so significant that you have to identify them by rule. And it's hard to do. You would be surprised how hard it is to get one of those rules through to designate a class 1. So what you are left with is the class 2. And they're saying in those designated areas, your designated downtowns, your opportunity zones, and there are a lot of opportunity zones. Some municipalities are entirely an opportunity zone. And in those areas, you can develop in an unmapped class 2 wetland.
Representative Pelley,
You keep bringing up the executive. Is there wording? I don't recall wording in the executive order that seeks to circumvent any of the restoration requirements. Just a change of the size of or the the dimension of the buffer.
Well, remember, when the EO was passed, the secretary issued guidance on how the agency was gonna comply with it. And she said that they had to go to rulemaking. And the way that they have proposed the rule would put all the allowed development under the EO into an allowed use that doesn't require a permit underneath the current wetlands rules. And if it doesn't require a permit, it doesn't need to do compensation, restoration, et cetera. So the EO, you're right, doesn't say circumvent, or you don't need to do compensation or restoration or net gain. Doesn't say
To reduce the buffer.
No, if it's unmapped, you can develop in it. It's not regulated if it's not on the map. That's a big, big change. It's against existing rule and statute.
And so by saying it's an allowed use, it has corresponding consequences, like not needing to do mitigation, not needing to do compensation. So
Representative Logan.
Yeah, so I guess the way I would restate that would be that they didn't need to say that they were circumventing statute in the EO to circumvent statute by just making it an allowed use. It circumvents, or it appears that it may circumvent statute based upon the way that the rules are being promulgated.
I'm just saying that the draft rule as currently drafted will raise issues about conflict with statute and conflict with what is required under the statute. And I think if they call it an allowed use, they will have arguments to say, no, it's something that the secretary has discretion to authorize under statute, and therefore it doesn't conflict with statute. But that takes you back to the purpose of regulation of wetlands, which is statutory and which is not being changed. And then that brings in the legislative intent argument, which I'm not opining on.
It's exempt from them. Randolph is entirely in it.
Opportunities.
Sorry, I just looking at
We can go ruin all of his wetlands.
Yeah,
the.
build right over.
They're on that.
If they're on that.
So there's another one, Royalton, entirely. 25 opportunity zones in Vermont.
25?
Based on census tract, so if your town is entirely one census tract, I guess, maybe your whole town got it.
So what also is part of the conversation is Act 121 required the wetlands rules to be amended. And as you know, they're being proposed for amendment, but they're not including anything that you required them to include in the amended rules.
Yeah.
For example, on page 26, first line, the rules are supposed to incorporate the net gain rule into requirements for permits. That's, I don't know if they're going to do that. It's supposed to require the 2-to-1 ratio into the rules for permitting. It's supposed to require permittees to conduct 5 years of post-restoration monitoring for the restored wetlands. Those rules are, I have not seen a draft of those.
Exists.
And the deadline for those rules has not changed in the DEC miscellaneous.
Didn't change it.
But they are not proposing to change the date, and I've not seen On page 27, section 919. One of the things that Act 121 required is the agency to start reporting to you, the General Assembly, on annual losses and gains of significant wetlands in the state. That was supposed to begin April 30th, 2025. That date has not changed. It's supposed to include the location and acreage of class 2 wetland and buffer losses permitted by the agency.
They did originally asked for 6 months on the 2-to-1 mitigation rules to December 1, 2025.
It's supposed to include the acreage of class 2 wetlands and buffers gained through permit-related enhancement, number of site visits and technical assistance. And then on or before April 30th, I'm on page 28, on or before April 30th, 2027, which is not changed in the DEC bill. They're supposed to give you a report on the status of the wetlands in the state, the trends of wetlands, the results of the mapping projects, relevant updates related to class 1 and class 2 wetlands to include additional wetlands identified. And then part of the conversation in 2024 was to allow certain uses as allowed right away. And that included relocation of utility lines and poles adjacent to roadsides and temporary access to wetlands, river, and flood restoration projects that are currently there was concerns that some of these things were not getting done quickly enough, not getting permitted enough. And you just said your agency, you're going to allow as an allowed use relocation of utility lines and poles and temporary access to wetlands, rivers, and flood restoration projects. And then you're moving out of wetlands. You're moving into section 15B. Right now, when you have a direct discharge into Lake Champlain or Lake Memphremagog, that direct discharge has to meet the 0.8 milligrams per liter standard for phosphorus. There are a couple of exceptions. You added a new exception in 2024 for discharges of less than 35,000 gallons per day from a municipally owned secondary sewage treatment plant using recirculating sand filters in the Lake Champlain drainage basin, permitted on or before July 1, 2001, unless the plant is modified to use of technology other than recirculating sand filters. That's pretty specific, huh?
Mm-hmm.
And it was because it's specific to one plant that had done everything that it could do. That the upgrade to take it out of the recirculating sand filters would have cost millions and millions of dollars for a user base that was very small.
Sure.
And so you decided not to put that financial burden on them, to require them to still be permitted and still meet the standards that they're meeting. And A&R was okay with that. So this is also related to the proposed changes to the wetlands rules on the EO, but in section 16, 10 VSA 1274, there's enforcement authority for any damage to the ecological functions of wetlands in violation of Chapter 47, the Water Quality Law, or Chapter 37, the Wetlands Law, or that any person has failed to comply with any provisions of any order or permit issued in accordance with this chapter or Chapter 37. The Secretary may bring suit in the Superior Court in any county where the discharge, damage to wetlands, or non-compliance has occurred to enjoin maintain compliance and mandate restoration of damaged wetlands. So, I think if the proposed changes to the draft rules are allowed uses, you wouldn't trigger this. But it's just another thing to reconcile when the rule is going forward, how this reconciles with the draft rule.
Representative Chapin, yeah.
Can you describe why you think it wouldn't trigger this? It seems like it would to me, so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, so the first one is any person has discharged or is discharging any waste or damaging the ecological function in violation of chapter 37. So if you have an allowed use authority, you wouldn't be in violation of chapter 37.
But what if your allowed use authority is in violation of chapter 37?
I'm sorry.
What if your allowed use is in violation of that? Could the developer be liable for breaking a state law under the EO?
I don't think so. I think the way that they're gonna draft it is they're gonna avoid that. Or at least they're
They don't
gonna,
draft law. The law is clear.
but remember, if you're gonna do an adverse activity in a wetland, you need a permit or you need to be in allowed use. If you're one of those two things, you're complying with chapter 37. So
It also says this chapter or chapter 37. What's this chapter?
that's the water quality chapter. That's the one that prohibits discharges to waters or wetlands. Stormwater, that's what I call the diva chapter. That's like got everything in it. It's like 3 acre and reporting pollution, combined sewer overflows, and that's like the high profile stuff. It's in chapter 47. Water quality standards, TMDLs, all chapter 47.
It's a single family house. And it has a septic system. Maybe that septic system would be a discharge.
You can never know until you have the actual facts, but that's a scenario that could happen.
In that case, it would be a violation here.
You would potentially have that, but then the question would be, would that wetland? I don't, I'm just speculating. But A&R needs to figure out how they're gonna reconcile.
Bad water is gonna happen.
Representative Austin.
Yeah, just wondering who's liable if the state doesn't require that development doesn't follow best practices based on science. Like just this morning, we heard the river, corridor issue and how much it's going to cost for Montrose to deal with this. Is this leading the EO? Is it now leading to another possibility that it's going to cost for Montrose money if a house gets flooded or a septic system gets destroyed because of changing rules?
I can't say absolutely no, and I can't say absolutely yes. It all depends on the facts of each situation. If you're gonna build in a class 2 wetland, even though it's not mapped, and it's residential housing, you should expect at some point that your house is probably gonna be flooded. And then if you're in a flood hazard area with FEMA National Flood Insurance, will that ultimately affect the rates of your neighbors and other people? It might. It might. So, but if you're not in the NFIP, if you're not in the flood hazard zone, will it still affect your insurance? Yeah, maybe. Probably because Vermont is such a small pool that like when there's a fire at one ski area, then all the other ski areas have to like take out their wood stoves because, you know, that's in order to avoid the increase in the flood in their property insurance. It's such a small pool, you can't spread that risk, that liability across enough people to keep the rates down. So, I mean, it's really, I can't say absolutely yes, absolutely no. Are there things that could happen? Yeah.
Right, we're hoping to get through this. Do we have you till 3? And do you need,
Yeah, I don't have to go anywhere else after this.
folks need a break right now, or can we keep going till the 4? Go.
Right before the floor.
Yeah,
You can now go to page 32. This is dams. For purposes of just efficiency and time, the big change in this is moving authority over a certain category of dams that are energy producing but not FERC regulated from the PUC's jurisdiction to DEC's jurisdiction. Right now, DEC, or prior to Act 121, DEC only regulated dams that did not generate electricity. Now, FERC regulates many of the dams in Vermont that produce electricity, but there were dams created before FERC that were generating electricity and that are not regulated by FERC, that the PUC was regulating. So you had two different dam safety standards, two different entities regulating, two different inspection standards, et cetera, et cetera. You decided in Act 121 to, for purposes of safety, design, change, et cetera, to move those PUC dams, which were like 23 dams, I believe, into DEC's jurisdiction. If there's a revenue, if there's an electric generation issue, PUC still has authority because PUC has authority over electric generation. But now you have one standard, one entity reviewing dam safety changes, et cetera. You're not duplicating that across two different agencies with different standards, et cetera. So that's largely what you'll see here, and you will see multiple changes where it says the state agency having jurisdiction is changed to the department. So that's, I think you can pretty much, honestly, if you want to skip ahead, you can just.
I want to skip too lightly over this just because it's a topic of interest to the committee this session. And also we added a definition of dam removal here that I'm noticing.
Right, and that was because later on in this section, you amend the revolving loan fund that was available for funding dam removal. And it used to be only essentially for just like emergency situations for a dam removal or fix. You change that fund so that it's available for non-emergency and emergency purposes. And what constituted a dam removal needed to be defined. And so that's really the first change in this chapter.
You know, yeah, change of jurisdiction, we understand that. Maybe that's everything.
So dam removals, all actions needed to eliminate the risk of dam failure related inundation below the dam and include partial or complete structural removal to the extent that the dam is no longer capable of impounding water, liquid, or sediment. That's an important thing to remember. A dam is not just water. It's potentially manure, it's slurry, it's sediment, it's other things that are held back by, and you can look at the definition of a dam. Any artificial barrier that is capable of impounding water, other liquids, or accumulated sediment. So there are dams out there that you don't even know are dams. Page 34 going on to 35, this is the key section switching jurisdiction of the PUC dams to DEC, except for those that are subject to regulation under the Federal Power Act. That means FERC. All of the records that PUC had for those dams regarding safety, construction, planning, emergency planning, they all got transferred to DEC. Page 36, whenever you're going to construct, enlarge, raise, lower, remodel, reconstruct, or otherwise alter a dam that's capable of impounding more than 500,000 cubic feet of water, you have to get authorization to do that from DEC. Provided, and you'll see page 36 in the middle of the page, provided that an application for activities that require authorization under 30 VSA 248, that's electric generation, shall also be approved by the Public Utility Commission. So PUC still has authority over generation. And then the next few changes are basically just regarding the transfer. And why don't we stop at page 39, section 2086. In order to get that authorization I told you about, the agency needs to determine that the construction of the dam, the alteration, et cetera, serves the public good. And there's a list of what qualifies as the public good on page 39 going on to page 40. So you might hear somebody say the dam had to get a CPG. It's not technically a CPG, it just needs to be in the public good. On page 41, before Act 121, there was a requirement that DEC employed a engineer to investigate property, review plans and specifications and make additional investigation. You said an engineer needs to be under the control of DEC, so it include an independent consultant hired by either the department or the project proponent. So DEC doesn't have enough engineers to do review of all plans and specifications, so they can just hire people to do it. The next major change is on page 44. The bottom of the page, all inspection reports available on the department website for public review. So every time there's an inspection of a dam, that inspection report is supposed to be publicly posted on DEC's website. And for dams owned by the state, the department shall provide the inspection report to a designated point of contact for the dam at the state entity owning the dam. So you're gonna know how and what shape dams in your towns are in, because the inspection reports have to be publicly posted and publicly circulated. And then if the department determines that a state dam is unsafe and in need of repair or removal, the department shall immediately notify the designated point of contact of the state entity that owns the dam and make this information available to the public on the department website. And then you get to the changes to the dam safety revolving loan fund. So this used to only be available for reconstruction, repair, removal, breaching, draining, or other action necessary to reduce the threat of a dam failure. Well, the argument is you're waiting for it to get to a condition where it's gonna fail before you put resources into repairing it, altering it, etc. Shouldn't there be some opportunity to repair a dam before it gets to that point? And so that's what this change does, page 45 sub B. The fund shall be available for both emergency and non-emergency projects to be eligible for a loan. It shall meet the conditions associated with the funding type. For emergency funding, it has to provide emergency for critical time-sensitive temporary safety or risk reduction measures such as reservoir drawdown, partial breach, stabilization of buttressing. And to be eligible for emergency funding, the dam must meet the following criteria: must be under the regulatory jurisdiction of DEC, must be in need of critical time-sensitive safety or risk reduction measures. For non-emergency funding, for permanent safety or risk reduction projects such as repair, rehabilitation, or removal, to be eligible, you must meet that criteria, must be in DEC's jurisdiction, must be classified as significant or high hazard potential dam. So high hazard means if it fails, it will cause the loss of life. Significant means if it fails, it's going to potentially cause the loss of life and will cause the damage to property. So that's high hazard, significant. And then there's high hazard with population at risk. So high hazard, if it fails, it's going to create a loss of life. And generally it's like if it's 1,000 or more or 100 or more. So just be aware of that. For funding for non-emergency repair or rehab, the dam owner shall provide an operation and maintenance plan, safety compliance schedule, as well as financial information to show sufficient resources are available to maintain the dam and comply with dam safety rules. And for non-emergency, that will, for non-emergency construction, it shall provide proof of the applicable legal and state and federal permits. For non-emergency funding, and alternative analysis must be done to look at what else could be implemented to address the non-emergency needs. And then it's going to be more clearly a revolving loan fund where it's going to be low interest, no interest loans, some grants, but rarely. And then they will report to you, page 48, regarding operation and administration of the dam safety program, details on loans, description of each project funded, for emergency loans, justification for the emergency and the explanation of why it was needed, and then a projection of loan repayment. The revolving loans that DEC administers right now, they do pretty well. They do pretty well. They don't have many defaults. And they're healthy. Page 49, section 1107, that's just the print of the fiction. Same page 51, section 19. And then page 52, line, section 20, subdivision to the dam safety design standards. They were supposed to be adopted by July of 2024. Then you gave them to July 2025. They didn't ask for an extension because I think they're close, but they still haven't issued them.
Dam safety, what?
Dam safety standards, like for how to construct, how to install, how to do all of that. And then there's a study committee on dam emergency operations planning. So when there's a dam, there are things called emergency operation plans that generally municipalities utilize to respond to a threat of failure of the dam. Many municipalities lack the resources to adequately implement the emergency operations plan, equipment, technology, etc. So there was a study committee on that and how to improve that for hazards caused, to shift responsibility from emergency planning from individual municipality to regional authorities, how to improve regional implementation, how to fund dam emergency action planning. There was a report on this, wasn't earth-shattering. The agency isn't really making recommendations anymore. They're just like, here are your alternatives. And you pick. And so that's kind of what they did. And I can provide you with that report if you would like it.
Yeah. Yeah. Representative Chapin,
And there's a bill coming that follows up on those recommendations and.
did you
to
pick
the
one of
next
the
step.
alternatives? in your bill?
Yes, we did. So
Okay.
that'll be forthcoming.
Section 23, remember I told you that there were these class of dams that PUC had regulated because they were generating electricity before the FERC was created, for the Federal Power Act. Well, it's possible that FERC could regulate them. And so before transferring them, there was this concept that, hey, let's figure out if FERC's going to regulate them. And so by July 31, 2025, DEC in coordination with PUC shall file petitions for declaratory order from FERC to determine whether projects currently under PU's authority fall under FERC's hydroelectric license. That's going to take years, just FYI. And they might not even respond.
Did they do it?
I do not know. Section 24 is just the language regarding transition from PUC to DEC, and then the rulemaking for the dams. Page 57, section 25. This is moving out of dams, moving into basin planning. Do you know what basin planning is?
Some of us might not.
Yeah, there is a requirement under the Federal Clean Water Act that states engage in the continued planning process for the use of their surface waters. And Vermont implements that planning requirement by requiring that every one of the major basins, river basins in the state, have a plan for how it's going to be used, designating the water classifications in the water, identifying issues in the water, identifying where certain development might cause issues in the water, identifying projects that could be done in the water to improve water quality. So that's the basin planning process. For years, the basin plans were behind schedule considerably, but Neil took over, and Neil really kicked that division into into compliance. He did a really good job with that. And now all the basin plans are up to date. They are doing it. They are identifying all the things that they're supposed to identify. One of the things that this language would require them to do As part of what they have to go out and do, they shall identify opportunities to mitigate impacts of severe precipitation events on communities through implementation of nature-based restoration project or practices that increase natural floodwater attenuation and storage. They're going out and looking for flood control projects that are nature-based as part of the basin planning process. And then you get to foam. So expanded polystyrene foam, styrofoam, historically was used to float docks, buoys, barges, etc. But it breaks down over time, and it breaks down into significantly small particles that are very difficult to control or clean up. And many jurisdictions have been moving to the requirement not to ban the use of it, but to encapsulate it. That it can still serve that purpose of floating the dock or the buoy or the barge, but it has to be encapsulated to prevent the breakdown and release of the styrofoam into the water. But if you go to your dock store these days, you're gonna find no unencapsulated styrofoam. It's all encapsulated. It was largely, when this was passed, the dock. I'm sure you've all seen the dock doctor's car for trucks. And the dock doctors came in and said, we don't have a problem with this. This is what we use anyway. And so what will be interesting is the legacy use, which you did not really prohibit. You just said that it's a nuisance. So moving through this chapter, page 60, for when you're installing, repairing, removing, and selling buoys, docks, or floating structures, the polystyrene foam needs to be encapsulated. That's the bottom of page 60. You prohibit the unencapsulated polystyrene in open cell use or open cell installation. For methods of encapsulation, there's methods on how you encapsulate, including some abilities for small gaps and other connections. And then for sale or distribution, you ban the sale or distribution of unencapsulated, but you don't require the removal of the legacy. And that was a big issue, and it was decided not to do it, but you then included this provision that the use of unencapsulated polystyrene as a flotation device in waters is declared a nuisance and public health hazard and may be prosecuted as provided in the Vermont revised statutes. And I don't know who is ever gonna do that. I don't see an attorney general prosecuting that as a nuisance, but it's there. State's attorney, local, or I just don't see that happening, but it's there. And then there was a required report on whether and how to waive A&R or Natural Resources Board permit fees for low income or others. Not surprisingly, the report was no, don't waive them.
It's what?
Was no, don't waive them. They didn't want to create inequity between the permitted activities.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you,
so
Michael.
much.
Very helpful. Folks have questions, they can go to Michael directly and get them answered, and we're to the floor now. So we're adjourned for the afternoon.